other in the name of unilateralism and patriotism. Now we have moved past this to times in a global age, but our study of the past has not changed to reflect this. In order to remedy this, we stand to propose the motion. This House believes that the study of history should only be taught from an international perspective. We'll get into some terms, and then we'll bring forth our arguments. So firstly, we define this House as all countries of the world. We define school as primary and secondary schools, both private and public. We define history as the study of historical events from the beginning of humanity to present day, including current events. And we define international perspective as an educational information compiled from a wide variety of worldviews. For example, an international perspective on the history of the Cold War would teach both the Russian and American views of the conflict. Furthermore, in our model, an international curriculum will be developed and continually amended by an educational community with representatives from every nation in the world. So we want to propose what we're going to be proving to you today is our burden that international perspective is better than a national to the exclusion of the latter in a history classroom. What we think that side opposition needs to prove to you today is that an international perspective is worth sacrificing to build a national identity. So we're going to be proposing three arguments. Firstly, we're going to propose the argument back in time, which talks about the quality of education. Secondly, we're going to talk about Give Me Everything, which is about the danger of a single story. And thirdly, we're going to talk about international love, which is talking about global impact. So, moving into this first argument about back in time and the quality of education. We think that there are essentially two main objectives of education. Firstly, to prepare you for life after education, and secondly, to bestow knowledge upon the student. So let's get into this first idea of preparing for life after education. We believe that the objective is to equip the student to be successful, to contribute to their country, their community, and the world. I'll take you.
Wouldn't you agree that most of the students or 90% of the students will stay in their own country? It's better if they're being taught a national history than some international.
We think that while many students will stay in their country, we don't think that means that they're only going to encounter people from their country, which is exactly my point. We think as a part of this, we fully expect individuals to be encountering people from many countries throughout their lifetime, regardless of whether or not they stay within their country. We think the importance, therefore, of having an international perspective of the world and an international understanding is increasingly important. Why is this? We believe that it's because it builds an appreciation for the other person, their worldview, and where they have come from. We think that when you start to build this understanding, that's when our world is more successful. So we think that when it comes to preparing for life after education, and even while you're in education, we think that you need to have that international perspective and that international understanding. Which brings me to our next subpoint, thank you, which is about how it bestows knowledge upon the student. We think that the goal of schools is primarily to give knowledge to the students. We think that schools should not be encouraging dogmatism, where you only look at one side of the story. In fact, we think if our goal is to be bestowing knowledge, we should be bestowing as much knowledge and as varied knowledge as possible, thank you. And so we would say that side opposition needs to come up here and tell us why if school is about giving knowledge, why we would ever limit knowledge within a school, because we don't think that's reasonable on our side of the house. So instead of teaching solely about European Enlightenment, what we think is that you should also be teaching about, over 14,000 years ago, there was a Muslim Enlightenment as well, where we had algebra invented by Algebra. And so, Avicenna, a physician, did exceptional work. What we see is that what happened was in the Crusades, the Europeans came and they took that knowledge from the Muslim Enlightenment and have claimed that knowledge ever since. What we think is that that shows a unilateral worldview, and we think that that doesn't create and bestow the maximum amount of knowledge that should be bestowed upon these students. We think that that's not a holistic education. We don't think that's a good education, and that's why we're here to propose today that we should be giving an education with as much knowledge as possible and as varied as possible. That's what we're proposing. So thank you. Furthermore, we see instances like the British textbooks are being used in the Commonwealth countries. We think that that creates a unilateral worldview. We don't think that's good. What we think is that all worldviews should be seen and understood. No, thank you. So that finishes up our first point about how we talk about the quality of education and how we think it should be fulfilled. Which moves me to our second point, which talks about the danger of a single story. We have 3 subpoints under this. Firstly, we're going to talk about how it enables propaganda. Secondly, we're going to talk about how it excludes other viewpoints. And thirdly, we're going to talk about multiculturalism within a country. So under this first idea of how it enables propaganda, what we say is that the acclimatization to a single viewpoint creates a form of psychological conditioning of thinking. What we see is that people are conditioned to understand that a single viewpoint is absolutely correct, and it's absolutely, no thank you, is absolutely acceptable. Conversely, we think that when you are in a learning environment and you're conditioned to this idea of critical thinking and you see multiple worldviews, then when someone comes in and tries to tell you that only one way and there's only one side to this story, we think that that's when you're going to be critical. We think that's when discussion is actually going to happen. That's when we think it's going to be the best. Go ahead.
Okay, and what we see is that the national side of the history doesn't exclude like what happens in the other.
We think oftentimes it does exclude other people's worldviews. We think that when certain countries are teaching a story, they teach it from their side, and we think that that exclusion of the other worldviews is problematic. For example, when we look at Palestine and when they're teaching the history, we think that's exclusive of the Israeli side. Conversely, we think that when the Israeli population is teaching the view of the conflict, we think they exclude the Palestinian side. We think that that happens all too often with our world, and we're happy to present even more examples of where that happens. And so what we're telling you is that's not acceptable within the world today. Moving on, we think that because, so we've talked about this idea of propaganda and how it enables it. We think that critical thinking is absolutely important. No, thank you. We think that people are less susceptible to propaganda when we train them to use critical thinking. We think that happens best within a history classroom. Okay. We think that propaganda itself is bad because it enables governments to inflict harm on the people themselves. We look at Stalin in Russia. We think that that's problematic when the people are accepting of singular worldviews and when they're not conditioned to critical thinking. Second subpoint, exclusion of other viewpoints. We already talked a bit about this, but we think that when you exclude other viewpoints within your country, it suggests that they're unimportant and that they shouldn't be a part of your curriculum. What we think is that's problematic because it devalues people. Moving on to our third subpoint, which talks about multiculturalism. We think that within a country, there are increasingly numbers of multiple cultures within a country. We think as such, especially in countries like Canada and etc., we think that when there's this movement of countries amongst each other, we think that that's problematic if you don't understand where these other people are coming from or when you devalue their opinions. For these reasons, essentially what we think is that it harms the cohesion of a country when they don't understand the cultures within it. For these reasons, we beg to propose. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now call on the floor Ms. Sophia to open the debate on the side of the opposition.
Opposition saw throughout her first speech was the fact that she decided that national perspective, in fact, only means that there's one view and one view only that is promoted on the kids and taught to the kids as a whole. And what we as an opposition standing for today, and what I'm going to do in my speech first of all, is clarify what in fact a national perspective means, because clearly they have not been able to do that so far. I'll first start by clarifying this, and then I'll move on to their arguments, and then I'll analyze the link between history and the behavior of politicians in a society. And then I will link it back to how school has an effect on that, and why we should teach the kids, why we should teach them about national perspectives and not international perspectives. So let me first move to our case study. We as an opposition strongly believe that in fact our major task at school education is to prepare these students for the future and for society. The society basically is influenced by the national perspective, which means in fact we as the school education must first family in fact introduce or make them teach them in fact about the national perspective, because that is what is first family important to the kids when they go into society, and they must know about that. So moving on to the team line, I will, like I said, analyze the link between history and the politicians, the behavior of society, and my second speaker will talk more about the national identity and how and school plays a huge role in that. So let me come to the rebuttal. First of all, let me clarify what national perspective means, because they clearly didn't get that on the side. It does not necessarily mean that we have one view in our country and one view only. And as you know, ladies and gentlemen, there are many different views in our country and many different views that can be presented in different ways. Furthermore, we see that these are taught by people, not by robots or anything that have only one view or one way. We have history teachers who know, in fact, what happened, what is wrong or what is right, or teach it from many different perspectives. And we see that, in fact, it's not the fact that national perspective is one perspective only. And we're not saying that, that we're going to only teach what the country as a whole says that. Take, for example, Germany, ladies and gentlemen, since we come from there. We're not taught that Hitler was in fact good or anything. We're not taught about the fact that the people thought that, or about the people that because they supported this nationalism, that it's a good thing or at all, even though that was in fact our national perspective back then. We're not taught about that. We're still taught about the other views in the society. But we see that that, in fact, is a part of the national perspective, and as we see it today. Why? Because we see that it plays a huge role, which I'll talk about later in my speech, that we're linked into that, and how, in fact, the national perspective, in this case, is in fact more important, because we as a German must learn about what happens in the past to create our own views now in society. But we must learn about what happened in our country and to build our opinion and to build our what we think about our country in the first before we can move on to anything else. So moving on to their arguments, which was A, how you prepare the child for life, and then B, the knowledge that we're passing on to students. We see that preparing the child for life doesn't mean that we have to first and we only teach this international perspective. But their only argument, or the only example they came up was the fact that you will encounter other people from other countries. Yet this has nothing to do whether or not you're taught international perspective or not. Much rather, it has much rather more to do with basically social skills and so on. We're saying that even if you're only taught a national perspective of the history, does not necessarily mean that you can't interact with other people from other countries. We see that has nothing to do with that, ladies and gentlemen. Moving on to the second part, which was the knowledge, that we're limiting the knowledge to students. As I stated before, national perspective does not necessarily mean that we're limiting knowledge, because we're not showing the views of other countries. In fact, we see that perspectives can be very different. Once again, in Germany, we have many different, and it's all in basically all the countries, especially in the United States, there's many different perspectives when it comes to the north or to the south of the country. So we see that, in fact, once again, we're not teaching only one perspective, only in history, but there are other different perspectives within the national perspective. Moving on to my own arguments, which are A, I'll first analyze the link between the international history and behavior of politicians. So what is this whole thing with national history? Well, we see that basically influences our society, because that is what your mentality is built upon. The society's habits are built upon what happens in the past. Let's take an abstract example, for example. You see that? Well, you have two countries that were in war for decades. Afterwards, since this war has been maybe this war has finished like 20 years ago, and both countries are well economically in partnership, they trade with each other and everything, but the society never forgets. They always still have this historical point on which they still are based upon. And we see that the politicians, in fact, represent that. Take, for example, Germany and external politics. When the country of Israel was created with the Jewish people in 1948, they were in fact friendly to them, or Germany was. But it took about 20 years until the first German politician actually went to Israel because of the fact of this historical point. We see because of the fact of this historical point, because the Germans felt that, in fact, that they do not actually were in the position to go there. And we see that that is also reflected on us, on society as well. Because of our national history, we tend to, in fact, the Germans tend to watch out when it comes more to racism and to what they say as a political, when it comes to political things and so on. Thank you in a second, ma'am. Moving on to the inner politics in the United States, take, for example, the healthcare reform. Since the United States, and as a national perspective, has the fact that they're mostly against communism or socialism, then they're also against this healthcare reform. Most of the Republicans say, for example. Because why? Because they see that in the past they've had conflicts with Russia and so on, and they see this as socialism, and they see the healthcare reform and the public health reform as a part of socialism, and therefore they do not want this. This also reflects the view that the society has on them. So, yes, ma'am.
What about the situations where this lack of international perspective is perpetuating this sort of conflict that has been so long standing, such as in Palestine and Israel?
Okay, so we see that okay, let's take for example Palestine and Israel. The people are already based on their own views. Why? Because of the fact of the history. Now, what we're seeing here is that necessarily by teaching them the school history on an international perspective is not going to create maybe a rather a good understanding between these two countries. Furthermore, we take the example of the teachers, who in fact is going to teach this. If you're in a Palestine country, you have Palestine teachers who are already influenced by these views, by the national perspective. So we see, and once again, that in fact does not work. We do not see how your international perspective of teaching students will in fact change anything that. Linking this back to the schools and what I just said about the politics, we see that we must prepare the kids for the majority of the kids. We're talking about the majority of the cases, the people that actually stay within the country and have these national views. We need a national perspective of history. We need to educate them to understand that first, and this is what we're basically standing here for today. We need to first educate them about their own country and their own perspectives that the society has, and their national perspectives first, before we can move on to teaching them about other views instead. Now you're off time. We see that the child must be educated in the first. Take, for example, Ireland and Northern Ireland. The Irish don't care whether or not the Argentinians get the Las Malvinas back or not. They much rather care about Northern Ireland, because that in fact infects them as a society as a whole. They care whether or not their friend is a part of their country who's living on the other side or not. So there's once again where we see that we should be teaching these kids about the national conflicts or the national history that has happened before, because that much rather affects them in the first place than that international perspective. Ladies and gentlemen, what we have shown you today is that, once again, national perspective does not mean one view and one view only, and we see that we must prepare the majority of the cases of the children who would live, in fact, within the country. And we must teach them about their country first, and their perspectives of society first, and rather than moving on to the international perspective. Thank you.
Now I give the floor to Mr. Henry Sue to give the second proposition speech.
Ladies and gentlemen, today we saw a side opposition who ran on the assumption that all countries are multicultural, that all countries have different perspectives, and that no country is, homogeneous. So what we on side proposition will prove to you today is in fact that the international perspective should take precedence over the national perspective. And in my point, I'm going to prove that the national perspective can in fact be harmful and can create conflict in our society. But before I get into that, I'd like to address the points presented on side opposition, starting from their clarification on this idea of national perspective. And so they said that the national perspective is the most important perspective, and they merely asserted that. What I'll be proving further in my speech, but what I'd like to mention now, is that we now live in a globalized world in which countries are integrated. And so therefore, in the modern day and age, we don't think that the national perspective in fact takes precedence over the international perspective, when the international perspective is quite prevalent in our society. Furthermore, they tried to say that the national perspective can include different viewpoints. And this was the one assumption that side opposition made, that somehow all states, are liberal democracies, that all states accept different viewpoints and all states will teach different viewpoints. But what we see in many countries around the world, like we've given examples of Israel, Palestine, India, Pakistan, that in fact not all viewpoints are accepted, not all viewpoints are taught by the state, and we think that that is not beneficial. Now let's go on to some rebuilding. So basically their clash against our education point was that same assumption that, there can be different perspectives. And once again, we don't think that this is true. We're going to be proving this later. Now, against our point on one perspective, they simply said again, there can be multiple perspectives within a country. And yet again, they're assuming that this country is not homogeneous. And many countries are, in fact, only accepting of one viewpoint. And we simply don't think that their point holds any water. No thank you. Now let's move on to their case. In their first argument about history and politics, they gave the German example that, Germans don't believe that Hitler was a great man. And, because obviously he wasn't. And at the end of the day, we don't think that that really proves anything. We understand that, yes, in their country, that, you know, their viewpoint has adapted, but we don't think that the viewpoints of all countries have adapted over time. For example, Turkey, they still don't accept that the Armenian genocide occurred. They still don't think that it actually happened, and they don't teach their students that. So not all states have moved on from their past, and some states still take their past as if they were in the right. And we find that extremely detrimental. No thank you. Now, first speaker did concede to the fact that, you know, teachers will teach, you know, based on their version of history, and we think that this is exactly what the problem is in our society today. That we think that these teachers are in fact mandated by the state, and therefore, if the government appoints the teachers and the government is teaching the students, then at the end of the day, the students are learning what the government is telling them to learn. And if the government has its own political opinions and its own political platforms and agendas, then that can move on to the students. No, thank you. Now to their second point on society. So they said that teaching the national perspective is the most important. Now, we have multiple responses to this. Firstly, we believe that their national perspective is still going to be included in the international perspective. That in our model, they would still be included. If we're teaching the history of Europe, the primary focus will be on Europe. But we're simply saying we're going to be adding an international perspective, and we're going to be looking at the issues from the international perspective as that country is within the fabric of the international perspective. Yes, ma'am?
How in fact are you going to promote this international perspective when you just said in the first place that there's countries that are homogeneous and have this one view as a whole?
Ma'am, that's exactly why we need to have an international perspective. Because within these countries, they're homogenous. They don't see another perspective, and we're adding this perspective. And in our model, we did say we're creating an international committee who would create an international curriculum catered towards the history program, so that all students around the world would receive this this information from around the world. And so, what this also teaches, the fact that your national perspective is the most important perspective, is it sets up this mentality that your country is more important than every other country. And we don't believe that this is a beneficial mentality to have either, because we think that on a global scale, when countries are globalized, that we need to accept the viewpoints of other countries.
Sure.
No, thank you. Then they brought up the Falklands as an example and said that, you know, most British don't care about the Falklands, and therefore they shouldn't be taught about the Falklands. We think that's a problem. We think that they should be taught about it. We think that they should be taught about, no thank you, the Argentinian perspective, because now the British are simply disillusioned and only look at the issue in one way. We think that example actually falls to our side of the fence. So now that I've deconstructed most of the evidence presented by side opposition, let's move on into the final proposition argument, that of the international community. And so under this international community idea, we have two subpoints. First, of globalization, and second, of conflict resolution. So let's begin by looking at globalization. Now the fact is, throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, the world has become more globalized. And we on side off proposition believe the curriculum must be adjusted for this globalization, for this cultural diversity, and for this international perspective. Countries are becoming more intertwined in their economies, in their politics, in their society. We see that Japan has an embassy in Angola, that China and South Africa are working together, that cultural exchange happens around the world, and the curriculum must adjust for the fact that countries are becoming more globalized. We also believe that this globalization not only is a trend in our world, but in many senses it's beneficial because, thank you, it creates greater understanding, symbiotic relationships, allows countries to tolerate each other, and help the community work towards a common goal. So, how does this relate to our education? No, thank you. Because globalization is taking place, it is essential to teach students in a global manner so they are accustomed to our day and age. We've moved beyond the point of nationalism, and we've gone into a day and age where we have to accept the international perspective, therefore we have to teach the international perspective. We must teach.
Point, sir. Sure. If an ambassador, for example, from China goes to Angola, of course he will just gain knowledge about that country. But what we see is that most of the students at first need education about their country and not about Angola, because China and Angola have nothing in common.
And they will get an education about their country. We're not saying that we're not going to be teaching them about their own country. Their country, their history will simply be embedded within this international curriculum. Their country and what happens in their country will simply be taught from an international perspective. It's not like we're eliminating their history. They will still be taught that. Now, the second idea about conflict resolution. Conflict usually begins when people strongly believe in one opinion, especially if you're taught from the age of 5 that this one opinion is correct. Once you grow older, you'll simply believe in that one thing, and we find this detrimental. For example, we brought up many times Israel and Palestine. They both believe that they have the right to the land, that their religion is superior, and they've been taught that, and therefore once they grow up, they believe that they should fight for that. Giving an international perspective will allow people to tolerate and accept other viewpoints. This will improve international relations because people will engage in diplomacy as opposed to violence. We saw in India and Pakistan, as soon as the split happened, both groups are taught that they have the right to Kashmir. We saw in Turkey that they denied the Armenian genocide. So we believe that when people are more accepting, when people are taught the differences, that they will not resort to conflict and resort to diplomacy. So at the end of the day, what we see is that we want people to develop this international perspective because our world is becoming more globalized. We want to prevent conflict around the world by allowing people to tolerate different cultures. And for these reasons, we're proud to propose this.
Right? Now call on the floor Ms. Yana Shonen to deliver the second speech of the opposition.
United University. Ladies and gentlemen, with the slogan of the European Union, welcome the second time recital position today. I'm the second speaker, and today I'll do a rebuttal, and after that, reading my succinct speech. So what we see is that the European Union is actually the perfect model for international politics, and still this slogan says that we talk about different habits and different identities coming together, so that they're not only one big unity. So first of all, I start off with my rebuttal. The first point they brought up was about the idea of education, and they said that if we have the national history classes, they are going to show only one side of the story, not teach the whole story of the nation. But what we told you, ladies and gentlemen, is that what we think the idea of education is to give the students the best possible education they can get. And what we see is that the best possible education is education is the best that prepares them best for their later coming life. And therefore, since we see that most of the people stay in the country where they live, therefore we see that it's most important to have first your own history at the first place, and first learn what was affecting your country. For example, as we already told you as well, was that if you don't have any national and international international history classes, they still don't teach like only the national point of view. For example, as my first speaker already told you, we in Germany, we learned that it was wrong what Hitler did, and we don't like appreciate what he did, and that this was like good or anything. What we say is that still, of course, we regret what happened, but still we learned first what happened in Germany and how our population was affected by this, and like this also influences the way we now behave, as we will talk about in our speech. Thank you. The second point was that they say that these history classes, they cause a problem with the interaction with other countries. But ladies and gentlemen, this is not the problem of the history classes. The interaction with other people are there mostly based on on your social skills and the way you behave, and you still learn about what happens in the other countries. So thank you. And so we don't see any problem there. We see that there is no thank you. No limited motion. The third point was again the limiting knowledge, and that we don't learn the same as we learn in the international history class. So they have an lack of knowledge. But ladies and gentlemen, as I've already told you, we teach what happened in the other countries as well. We just kind of teach it from more connected with the country where you come from, so you can better so you can better understand what happened in the country, what influenced your interests and so on. So the fourth point was that the history can cause conflicts, and then they brought up this example with Palestine and Israel and how they have conflict and are always against each other. But ladies and gentlemen, first we see that Palestine will always be against Israel. This can't be influenced by any historical. This can't be influenced by any historical lessons. even if we would teach it from an international perspective, this wouldn't change anything, ladies and gentlemen. This is just an old historic concept. No, thank you. And if they can't change it, it's more a problem of the society than of any historical lessons, ladies and gentlemen. No, thank you. And second of all, they never showed us anyway how they were planning to do this, how they would bring those teachers to teach a perspective they actually really don't want to teach at all. And just again, this is not a problem of the history that the teachers don't want to teach, but thank you. It's a problem of the society and what happened there. The fifth point was the globalization. But ladies and gentlemen, what we see and what we as opposition today stand for is that of course we see that globalization is important, but what we say is that globalization should not exclude any kind of national identity. We still want to keep our national identity, as I've already told you in my introduction. This is very important because we see that in the end of the story, most people actually stay in their country and still live there, so it's important for them to know what actually the values of the countries are. No, thank you. As an example, you could take the USA. They have lots of different states in the USA, and they still feel like it's one. They still like trade between each other, and they still feel like the USA. But if you ask somebody in the USA where you're from, they still say, "Oh, I'm from Texas. I'm different to a person coming from Minnesota or from I don't know wherever else." So they still kind of have their own feeling that they're not only in the USA, but still they have something else where they come from. So what we see is. It's important to first gain the knowledge about your own country, and after that, if you want to travel and have international relationships, of course you also learn something about other countries, but in the first place it's always still your own country, your own history, your own past, which is most important. No, thank you. Okay, so let me now come to my own sustained speech. So what we see and what my first speaker already kind of showed us, that the history of the country is clearly connected with the identity of the people. Of course, like we all have the same history. We all the knowledge that you're actually connected to the same past, of course, kind of brings you together as unity and creates some kind of national identity, because what you know and because your behavior will always be influenced, as my first speaker already told you, by what happened in the past. So why is this identity actually necessary?
How do you reconcile the fact that nations use their history and their perspective on it to perpetuate hatred towards other nations?
Okay, thank you. Okay, well, I've already talked about this in my rebuttal. If the nations have a problem with each other, this is not going to be changed by historical lessons. This has nothing to do with the things you get taught in school. This is a problem of the society living there and with the society itself, ladies and gentlemen. Okay, so why is the identity actually that important? The identity has a huge impact on the psychological development of the child, ladies and gentlemen. Just to show it in an easy way. If you have young people and they're in puberty, what they always do, how they behave is they try to find some kind of group where they can belong to, and some people that they can rely on. And this is because what they need is the security that they actually have somebody they can talk to and that they're not alone. And this is the natural way of human beings behaving. What you also see when you're grown up. And this is the same thing that's happening with our society. We're always looking for somewhere to belong to, somewhere where we can identify with, and that's why that's important to have kind of a national identity, ladies and gentlemen. Because then you get this, and because the security that you actually belong to somewhere, that you belong to a group, that you have people that can understand you, that you have the same path, this can only be given by some kind of national history. The knowledge that you're connected with other people to the same path, that your ancestors had the same the same experiences, that you're still as my first speaker told you, still influenced through the behavior is still influenced through the things that happened in your past. This can, of course, create some kind of national identity, which is very important for every person to give some security. And ladies and gentlemen, therefore, a child in China will always be more interested in the epical march of Mao Zedong than in the French Revolution or anything else. So for all those reasons, please vote negative today. Thank you.
okay? To deliver the third proposition speech.
What we saw in this debate today were two very distinct sides. We saw a side opposition that asserted that the preservation of a national identity is supposed to be the most fundamental, is supposed to be of paramount importance to a nation. They simply asserted that, whereas side proposition provided analysis to prove to you that first of all, a national identity is not completely lost on Northern Ireland, and that secondly, even if it was, that it was worth sacrificing a little bit of nationalism in order to preserve the integration of all nations in our world. This sort of globalized community and this sort of and the sense of community that we want to create on side proposition today must follow through, and this is why this resolution must stand. And what I'm going to do is summarize this debate through the scope of three lenses. Firstly, looking at the education system itself. Secondly, looking at this idea of nationalism. And finally, looking at this idea of the international community. So let's get into the first idea of the education system. And we saw from side opposition today were only a few points. So firstly, they talked about this idea of the teachers in the system. And he talked about the fact that in the very first few minutes of their speech, he talked about teachers being people too, saying that it's not necessarily robots who are controlling our education system, but they have a valid viewpoint. But then later on, they contradicted themselves by saying they can't adequately teach this sort of international perspective because of the fact that they have this this nationalist mindset already in place. And we think that if that's the case, that's a fundamental flaw within the education system that needs to be remedied. The reason, if anything, that these teachers aren't teaching is because they've never been told to teach this, to teach a more international perspective. We think that this resolution actually remedies that situation. So we think that if this is a flaw in our education system, we shouldn't simply just leave it as it is and say, oh, it's and blame it on, say, like a social issue. We think that we need to try and make changes within our education system to cater to the needs of our more globalized community. Now, secondly, they talked about this idea of having to learn about yourself first, and they never really provided any substantial analysis to this. They simply talked about, they tried to refute our example of China and Angola by simply saying China and Angola have nothing in common. What we'd say is that in a modern sense, yes, they do, because they're becoming more and more connected, whether it be through trade, whether it be through politics. So thank you. And we think that because of that changing mentality, we need to be able to teach based on different sort of perspectives. Now, what side opposition had the same responses was that you can teach these sorts of international perspectives and national perspectives separately. We think that we aren't trying to eliminate sort of like learning actual content about your national history. We're including your own subjective opinion on it, but we're allowing other people and other nations to have a viewpoint as well. So we think that it's actually improving the content that is being provided by this that is being provided by the education system. Now, what do we should be constructively outside politics? Within our first argument about the quality of education, we talked about this idea of how we need to distill knowledge upon people. We talked about this idea of having a more holistic, education system. And side opposition simply said that you need to learn about yourself first, and that simply was asserted across the board. And we'd like to see some change by the third speaker. Now, we also talked about this idea of multiculturalism. We talked about how, in many cases, you're sacrificing the viewpoints within that nation. You think that because of the fact that lots of times it's sort of majority rules within that country, that's what the education system caters to. Not only are we helping this on an international scale, but we're allowing for different groups within a given country to have different perspectives shown throughout our education system. Even more importantly, what we talked about was this idea of how this national content isn't even at times coming from that individual nation. We look at the control Britain has over the education system of basically every Commonwealth country in the world, and we think that because of that sort of extremely powerful influence they have, the education system isn't even based upon that nation. So that assumption of side opposition once again falls.
Madam,
now on actually sure.
are you stating the fact that in South Africa, because they're part of the Commonwealth, that they're in fact that they only learn about the British views?
No, we think that the problem is okay, so maybe South Africa would be one exception. We think that even if that is the case, and that's an exception, not a rule, what we think is that having that heavy influence on solely Britain is a bad thing. We think that if other nations do have input on the situation, they should be also allowed to have their international perspective within that education system. We aren't trying to choose between either having having that national perspective. So we're trying. So what we're trying to prove on side opposition. This idea that the education system, so we aren't trying to choose between having a national perspective or having an international perspective. We're trying to choose between having only a national perspective, as we see under the status quo, or allowing that national perspective to work in cohesion with the international perspective. And we think that by creating that sort of education system, we are going to have better results. Now, on to the second idea, this theme of nationalism. What side opposition had to say about this was firstly they talked about the political system, and they talked about how everyone's basically going to change over time. They gave this brilliant example about Germany. We think that that's one example. We think that Germany isn't going to be the example. It doesn't like set the precedent for the entire global community. We think that lots of times
Point
is
nine.
actually what we think is that actually having this sort of having this dependency on society to make their own sort of opinion without actually trying to influence the education system at all. What we think is that then you're allowing this sort of thing, like to breed resentment, to breed this sort of superiority complex. And oftentimes it's this sort of one-sided history that actually perpetuates these sorts of conflicts. So we actually think that this isn't going to remedy the situation. If anything, if we keep it as a status quo, we continue to allow like Israelis and Palestinians to think solely your opinions are right. Or if we continue to allow Pakistanis and Indians to think only your opinion is right, you should only side with that, we are never going to get anywhere in our world. We think that the education system is based on this idea of nationalism. We think that only nationalism is a bad thing, and that's what we're trying to remedy on side proposition today. Now, the second idea they talked about under nationalism was that you can still maintain this sort of pride under the status quo, but still like be a part of a global community. And they talked about, and they gave this example of like American states. We think, first of all, that's not the same thing because we're talking about states within a given country. So we don't think that that's an international community. But even if we were to take into account that there are some cultural differences between the states, we still don't think that this is going to be able to apply to the international community because of the fact that there can still be resentment between different states within a given country, and we look to regions like Pakistan, where you actually see a very strong divide internally between these different tribal groups, such as the Balochistan, which wants to try and get freedom from that country. So we still think that this sort of perspective that is being clouded by the fact, and like giving the Pakistani example, the fact that only Urdu is spoken within their education system, we see that that doesn't allow for any different representation in the education system, even locally, let alone having that be on a grand global stage. So we think that on that level, nationalism is still fair.
Yeah.
So on to this final action shift.
Well, the blind factory of globalization, when in most countries national perspective is in fact the first thing that is taught to the kids and the first thing. Yeah, it can be the first thing, but we don't want it to be the only thing. That's the difference we're trying to show you on side proposition today. We don't think that you have to make such a strong divide between having a national perspective and an international perspective. Side proposition has never shown us why these two can't work together under our model. We think that they still need to prove that today. So on to this final thing in the international community. What they showed you was sure, this idea of people will never forget, and the fact that, and I dealt with that under nationalism, and even this idea of education isn't necessarily the problem, it's more of a social problem. What we think is that the education system is the basis for how you form societal views, for how you form a worldview within a country. We think that information and this sort of communication effectiveness is the catalyst for any change to happen within a country. So you think that in order to create a more international perspective, you need to have this sort of change taking place, and we think that this resolution actually puts that pressure in the education system, which is important. Even further, what we talked about was this idea of globalization and how the community, or the curriculum, must reflect that. And we also talked about this idea of conflict resolution time and time again, which once again has still gone uncontested. So it's for all these reasons, because of the fact that we can integrate different cultures rather than simply trying to preserve one, that this resolution must ensure those steps. Thank you.
All right, I now call on the floor, Mr. Vincent Gold, to deliver the last constructive speech of the debate.
Ladies and gentlemen, I thought this debate was going to be kind of fun because I hoped we would talk about national identities and identities all over the world and global governance. Oh well, as long as this debate became pretty messy, then the only real argument that the opposition brought up was that assumption of subjectiveness. That of course we have all over the world subjective opinions in the populations. I want to focus on that argument first in my introduction, and I want to really emphasize that, and that you, the judges, please remember that in the debate. What we see is that you have to base that debate on rational teachers. Teachers teaching their students, doesn't matter if in an international perspective or a national perspective, teachers teaching the students a rational basis. Because what we see if we're talking, for example, about a teacher of Palestinian, it doesn't matter if we have a commission of people just establishing an international perspective and a curriculum, because the point is, even though the teacher reads on his papers in the curriculum that that you have to teach the students this internationally, he will ever have that of his opinion on the stuff, on the history, and he will in every case teach the students his opinion on it, even though no thank you, and the curriculum stands something other. And no thank you. And what we see, this is a problem of the society itself, and we in this debate don't have to work on that problem. Of course, we can, no thank you, work on the subjectivity of people, on the conflicts in the world. Of course, we can say, hey, Palestinian bodies, look at the Israels, they weren't as bad. But this is not the motion today. The motion should be how we actually fight conflicts in the world. The motion should be whether or not an international politics perspective, completely rational, is better for a student. Point. And not thank you, ma'am. And what we see is that also an international perspective in an irrational way is bad. So let me further analyze that in my three main areas of rebuttal. The first one is about definitions and models, which were pretty messy in today's debate. The second one is about the duty of the education, and the third one is about globalization. So ladies and gentlemen, let me start with my first area of definition and models. I actually have two major questions we as an opposition have to answer today's debate. The first one is about what is actually an international perspective. This is something pretty, this is about the model of said proposition. And secondly, does the national perspective exclude other views? But let me come to the first question. Ladies and gentlemen, what we see is that said proposition actually stated a completely inconsistent model, because we as a opposition really had a hard job, because at first they say we have an international perspective. Then they said, of course, we also have a national perspective in our international perspective. And what we see, in the, no thank you, in the status quo, of course, if we teach an international perspective, we also have kind of an international perspective. We don't just teach anything, no thank you, everything about national perspective, because if you have to just decide a new model. Are we talking exclusively about international politics or about national politics? And if you're not thinking some kind of message, the first speaker states something, and the second speaker say, of course we also have some kind of national perspective, so we also have a national identity. Please, no thank you, no thank you. Please, side proposition, clarify that in your replies, please. No thank you, ma'am. So, then you're harassing me. I'm sorry. Sorry, ladies and gentlemen. What we see is that, I'm sorry. So, what we see is just to the point of propaganda. If they also say in their international perspective, they also will have some national perspectives taught. We see that if the teacher wants to actually, no thank you, put propaganda on the students, they actually would have the chance. So let me come to my second question in that area. No thank you. So that, does the national perspective exclude other views? This is kind of a definition question, ladies and gentlemen. What we see is, of course, we on side opposition don't debate for a system where you only teach the opinion of one country, where you only just talk about your opinion. And this is undebatable, and this is just narrowing down this on-side opposition. Because what we see is the proposition is just narrowing us down, because what we see, of course, in a national perspective, we want to focus on our country, but we will still want to have different views on what in our country actually happened. And what we see is, if we, for example, had some several conflicts in our history, our country had several conflicts, we still can focus on that conflicts, and we still can also focus on the opinion of other states on their conflicts. But at first, I think we just should talk about what happened in your country. And, ladies and gentlemen, we can also just say that we would have, if we would just debate said propositions case, or said propositions model, ladies and gentlemen, what we see is that opposition has a much too hard job, and I beg you judges, please just recognize that. But in my next two areas of rebuttal, I will show you, even though we would accept side opposition's definition, we would still win this debate because of their inconsistent case. So let me come to my second main area of rebuttal, which will deal also with two major questions. The first one, is a national perspective capable to prepare you for life? And secondly, is national perspective actually a good base for knowledge? So let me come to my first question. Ladies and gentlemen, I just said in my PI that maybe 90% of the people getting educated in a country will stay in that country. So what we see is that if you want to prepare somebody for a certain thing, you should at first focus on your history. You should at first focus thank you, sir. You should at first focus what happened in your country, that you understand the people, and as my first speaker told you, that you understand, for example, the actual, the politicians, what they do, because what we see is we have, that, for example, a clear disparity in between Europe, where we have a state of solidarity, and in the USA, where we have just that fighting for freedom, for the individual freedom. And what we see is that this isn't really about actually rational discourse. This is about an identity. Which you have to understand as a student. And this is really important, that you understand what is actually happening in your country, and that way you have to be taught not thinking at first your own perspective. And ladies and gentlemen, of course you will interfere with other people, and of course we live in a globalized world, but ladies and gentlemen, school major task is at first to prepare you for the most important stuff. Because and if 90% of the people staying at home are thinking, school should prepare these 90% of the people which are staying at home. And if you move away, and if you meet other people, you are still capable of learning something about other cultures. This is not mutually exclusive, that you still educate yourself, that an ambassador of China going to Angola still educates himself. So ladies and gentlemen, let me come to my second question in that area of rebuttal. To that point, is national perspective a good base for knowledge? Ladies and gentlemen, most important, I told you, the most important knowledge for somebody living in a country should be its own actual issue. Yes, ma'am.
But recognize that even if an ambassador to Angola educates himself, because of democratic systems throughout the world, the population influences these people. And even if they're educated on the issue, doesn't mean the population who makes the ultimate decision is.
Thank you, ma'am. But what we see is that if we want to fight subjective and bad actually tendencies in societies, we have to fight much deeper problems in the identity of people. And this can be taught by, this can be just that in a national system of national perspective, we would have subjective teachers, because we have in every case subjective teachers. And even though you say, teachers, please teach an international perspective, he will still be subjective, and he will still be just teaching the students what he really believes. So ladies and gentlemen, what we see is that the national perspective is a good base for knowledge, because most important knowledge is just you can't teach about your country first. And what we see to the point that, for example, out of history, also conflicts are created. Ladies and gentlemen, what we see is that of course society gives you an opinion on something, but if you have a rational teacher which teaches you at first your own opinion, your own national perspective, you can understand these conflicts, and we can be, for example, work on this conflict in Palestine and Israel better. So let me shortly come to my last small area to the globalization. Ladies and gentlemen, the question is, does globalization need a global life, need global identity? I just can really say no. We have the slogan of the European Union, united in diversity. We want to preserve national identities, but still live international, because we see that you need your own security, that you have a society with the same identity you can base on, but still live international. Thank you, dear ladies and gentlemen, for your attention, and we stand proud of our position.
Now we have the floor to Mrs. Sophie to deliver the first reply speech.
Throughout this debate, we saw a rather inconsistent proposition, stating a model, but then changing it, stating something again, but then taking it away, and so on. For that, it was very difficult for us on side opposition, once again, to exactly take the debate as a whole and find actual clashes, or actually decide on what they were actually saying here in this debate, or not. Yet, I managed to somehow find three main areas of clashes, and I formulated into three questions. First question is, which should be taught, a national perspective or an international perspective? Then I'll be moving on, will there be a change through their plan in society, and then in the educational system? And then my last question is, how did globalization actually happen in the first place, and will this international perspective actually add to it? So starting with the first question, what should be taught in fact? Well, they stated in their first speech that, well, we're talking about international perspective, which means we're talking about both sides of the story and everything. Then she stated, but we'll be talking mostly about the whole thing as a whole, and we'll be talking about basically the entire world as a whole, rather than focusing on main things. Yet, the second speaker came up and stated, well, we'll be focusing on the national, and we'll embedding the national perspective as well. Now, what we stated here is that there was a lack of clarity in the model because they did not correctly see on what in fact they wanted to teach their children in the first place, whether it was only the opinion of the other nations or the opinion of their nation themselves. And even if they were teaching the opinion of the national perspective as well, then they're basically agreeing to our principle in the first place, which is the fact that the national principle is, in fact, important for the kids and for the society, which is what we're saying. What we further stated throughout this debate was that it was not enough. Even if they were adding it to their model, it was clearly not enough. Because first of all, ladies and gentlemen, you need to know about yourself before you can do anything else. You need to first know how to walk before you can run, ladies and gentlemen. And so what we see clearly here is that you must first learn about your country before you can start talking about others, before you can keep on learning about other things, about globalization and so on. We said this is the main step that we face that we must create for the majority of the children, as we stated through our free speeches. And that is a critical point here, and that is clearly not enough inside proposition, and they haven't seen that throughout this debate. Moving on to the second class, which was whether in fact we change our society. We said that by having this international committee, which would impose a new curriculum that in history lessons that would include this international perspective, then that would change the society's view. It was stated once again that teachers are not some kind of robots, ladies and gentlemen. They also have their views and they will impose these views when teaching the kids their views as well. Even if they were some kind of robots, then that leads me to my other point. Even if they were some kind of robots, it wouldn't mean that that would lead necessarily to a change in society, because we're talking about school kids here, and we've shown you that they're influenced by the society as a whole, not just by the teachers, right? Moving on to the feasibility of them. They also stated in their speeches that, well, because countries have this one view and this one view only, that, well, it's difficult for them to actually talk, or to be compared to the countries like Germany that have more views than liberal. Yet, in their plan, they also stated that by adding this curriculum, they're going to do that. They never showed us clearly how. If these countries already have one view, what makes your side proposition think that they will actually change their curriculum to actually add these international perspectives into that, when their only main goal is to enforce their own national perspective? So once again, we see that that won't change that. Furthermore, we also see that we must respect the views of these countries as well. It's not simply okay for them to state that we're going to change this when the country has its views up. There's a rule of respect that we must play here. Furthermore, we see that with the globalization, which is the main point of this debate, we see that in fact globalization has happened even though the schools focus on national perspective. We see that national perspective is not holding them back from globalization. In fact, it is still a main part of that. As I said, you need to learn to walk before you can run. You need this first phase of your country before you can move on to that. So, ladies and gentlemen, what we saw throughout this debate was that a country was actually giving you the base to keep on growing, whereas they weren't preparing their kids enough. They were giving this messy, entire national perspective, whereas we're giving you one perspective only, which you need to grow. Thank you.
Right? Ms. Brittany Hogan has the floor for the last speech of the debate.
We have integrated economies, cultural exchanges, and a unified global body. But we still have isolated education systems. And that's why we're here on side proposition, because we want to propose an integrated historical understanding and education system. Now, our model was clearly stated at the beginning. We said that an international perspective was educational information compiled from a wide variety of worldviews. And we gave you the example of the Cold War and how it would teach both Russian and American perspectives. Now, they only came up here and contested our model in the third speech, which we think is too late. But furthermore, we say that is your country not a part of the world? So if we're teaching the world perspective, obviously your country is going to be a part of that. That's what we proposed, and that's what we maintained from our side from the beginning. Okay, so we want to look at this debate in both a principle and a practical level, and we'll show you how we won on these grounds. So at a principle level, we told you in our first speech that the goal of the education system should be to bestow knowledge upon the students. We heard very little response to this on opposition. In fact, the only thing that we heard from them is that the national identity is the most important. What we said is that national identity can still exist, but through dogmatism or through hatred is not acceptable, and we think that's what's perpetuated when you offer only one worldview. That's why we proposed our model. We saw that opposition never gave us a solution to countries which only perpetuate one side of the story, which perpetuate hate. They just told us that every country teaches multiple perspectives already. We think that's false. So on a principle level, we think we won the debate on the idea that we should be bestowing knowledge. That's the importance of education. On a practical level, they told us that teachers have a singular perspective that won't teach this curriculum. And we had 5 responses. Firstly, we say that this can be checked through other methods. That's a problem with the system, like we can do national testing. Secondly, we see that at least the information slowly becomes available, and we think that information is a catalyst for change. Thirdly, we say that that's a flaw in the current system, and we, like already, that some teachers aren't teaching curriculum properly. We don't think that's exclusive to our problem. And fourthly, we say that they assumed that each teacher is going to oppose this change, and each teacher isn't going to teach the curriculum. We think that's a false assumption. And fifthly, we'd say that even if students are influenced by society, as they stated in their final speech, what we think is that society is also influenced by what they're taught at a young age, which is why we're proposing this. So even if people are radically changed in the first couple of years of this, we think that over time this information is going to make a difference. Now we say that furthermore on a practical level, the question is, will international perspective make a difference in conflict? We think that was fairly contentious in the round. They told us that no, that a lot of conflicts are just unsolvable and that's the way it is. And no matter what we do, there's nothing we can do about it. They gave us the example of Israel and Palestine. Firstly, we say that critical thinking disables the government's ability to send people to blindly fight wars. That's what we told you on our side in our first argument. Secondly, we say that conflicts are perpetuated through dehumanization. When you understand the motivations of people who are separate from you and who are from a different country, you're less likely to harm them. Thirdly, we said that information acts as a catalyst for change. And when that information becomes available in your schooling system, when it becomes widely available, we think that it's going to perpetuate some critical thinking as we talked about, and we think that that's going to promote change. We didn't say it's going to be the only solution and it's going to absolutely solve problems. We said that it's going to make it possible for these problems to be solved. Ladies and gentlemen, at a principal level, we told you why in schools we should be teaching more information if we can. And at a practical level, we told you why teachers why teachers aren't the only problem, and why conflicts can be solved when we start to provide information. For these reasons, we beg to propose. Thank you.
Like both shake hands and we'll call it in about 5 minutes.
Great job.
Thanks for this wonderful debate. We are all very good debaters. At the end of the day, we had a team proposition that came in with a practical beyond motion that were proposing progress and internationalization of culture, and also they were talking about international relations and how international politics will improve when you will teach common international history through all the countries, and they faced an opposition that we're talking about how national identity will be lost when we would apply the proposition's model, and also they raised some important points regarding the practicality, efficiency of their model. And also they were talking about how the quality of the educational system would be affected if we would apply the proposition 1. It was a split decision. 2 of 3 judges felt that King's proposition did a better job, so the debate went to King Canada. You can find us for individual comments and team advice on cases and team feedback on your cases today. I don't think we have lunch right now. Do we have? Yeah, or during lunch or after lunch, because probably we'll need to hurry up lunch. Right? Have any questions? Okay. Congrats, and I hope you do better in the next round. Thank you very much.